I'm not in favour of apologising for things you didn't do. None of us, for example, living now, were involved in 18th century slavery or slave trading. None of us living now were the victims of that. Apology and forgiveness are not appropriate in these circumstances. What we can do is we can lament the fact that some of our ancestors were involved in slavery, some of our ancestors committed atrocities against Aboriginal peoples, for sure. But again, let's have everyone tell the truth. Let's have some Aboriginal peoples lament what their people did to other Aboriginal peoples, for example. Let's not racialize this as white versus black, because there's sin all over the place. In terms of, this is a negative response to the idea of apology. We can lament what some people did in the past. Let everyone lament what their ancestors did. Let us admire what other ancestors did. And as for, does apologizing for what people did 200 years ago help? Well, in these circumstances, I fear it confirms the narrative that white people are guilty, or rather, non-Aborigines are guilty, whereas Aborigines are innocent. And how do Chinese Australians feel about this, or Vietnamese Australians, Indian Australians? They weren't at all involved. Their ancestors weren't even here. So who is, when one of your prime ministers apologizes, on whose behalf? So I think it's well intentioned. I'm sure it's well intentioned, but it's ill conceived. My view is, I'm with Peter Sutton on this. There are, as I understand it, 20% roughly of contemporary Australian Aboriginals languishing in remote communities and suffering from major social dysfunction. Let's address those problems and disadvantages in the most practical way we can. Trying to make 97% of Australia feel guilty for what happened 200 years ago doesn't help. It really doesn't. And there are plenty of Aboriginal people, I think, who would acknowledge that. But let's follow Peter Sutton and Warren Mundine, and let's address unfair social disadvantage among us in the most practical and effective way we can.
Jacinta Price would actually argue that Aboriginal people have not suffered or no longer suffer from the impact of colonisation.
Well, and I've been saying this to you Australians. I'm not Australian, I'm British. But the fact of the matter is, you in Australia, along a bumpy road, when bad things were done, as is bound to be the case with any state, you have built one of the most prosperous and one of the most liberal countries on earth. And you enjoy privileges and freedoms here that Chinese people and Russian people and Iranian people and North Korean people do not enjoy. And those privileges are open in principle to all people regardless of race. As I understand it, 80% of Australian Aboriginals live more or less like other Australians in cities or near cities, wage earners. There may be a gap in terms of outcomes where Aboriginal Australians are perhaps below the average, but I understand the gap is closing, and long may it close. So even Aborigines who languish in remote communities still have the privilege in belonging to a society sufficiently liberal to care about them and to try and solve the problem. Jacinta Price is right. Today, all Aborigines have reason to be grateful that they live in this kind of society, even if some of them languish and need help.
I think there's an important point there, if I could just clarify. My understanding is that in terms of closing the gap, many social indicators in the more remote communities are getting worse. And this is the point that Sutton makes, that 30 years of progressive politics hasn't reversed that. But what is true is that there are larger and larger numbers of Indigenous people, as Stan Grant pointed out to me. I don't think he'd mind me referring to it. Tens of thousands of Indigenous people now who have qualifications, tertiary qualifications, degrees.
Yes.
They've integrated, they're enjoying their life as Australians.
Yeah, good.
Yeah, as you say, the great gap is between those who live in the regional areas, really, and those who live in the city areas, which is sort of what you were getting at with the 80% who are roughly on parity.
Yes.
And this is, and I think One of the things that really worries me is that the more Indigenous Australians who are struggling in these regional areas, the more they hear things like, white man is the aggressor, Australia is a colonial enterprise, Australia is systemically racist, white man's ways are radically different from Indigenous ways. The more they hear that, the less inclined they're going to be to integrate into mainstream Australian culture and into the mainstream Australian economy. And that is the only way the gap can be closed. I think we've got to think very clearly about what we mean when we talk about closing the gap between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians. What we mean is that Indigenous Australians enjoy the same health outcomes as non-Indigenous Australians, the same educational outcomes, the same employment outcomes.
Safety.
Exactly, the same safety outcomes.
Their children, if they're molested, their justice will be done on their behalf.
That's right. And the only way all of these outcomes can be enjoyed is if they are integrated into a modern economy.
Doesn't mean made the same. It just means find their place in.
It means find their place in and no longer see modern mainstream Australian culture as a colonial imposition, but as an opportunity to make the most of themselves. And the good news is, as Nigel said, the overwhelming majority of Aborigines have actually done that. And so there's a sense in which, what do we mean by closing the gap? We mean for the remaining 20% to do what the other 80% have done. And that might mean, and people like Warren Mundine and Dr. Anthony Dillon and Gary Johns in his book, The Burden of Culture, a book very much worth getting. What that means is that a lot of Aborigines might have to consider coming out of the regional areas and going to the areas where there are jobs, where there are social services that are easily available, where they're closer to hospitals and things like that.
And I'm going to add the effective application of the law of the land.
Yeah.
Because if there's one thing that Indigenous women have often said to me, is that we want the normal standards applied that apply to every other Australian who bullies or molests or in some way damages a child.
Yep.
That's justice.
Yes.
And those kids, until you break that cycle of emotional violence, physical violence, moral violence, we know enough about children to know that there are some things you never recover from.